Back in the day, regional discounters were a dime a dozen, but few are as remembered as Jamesway. Although they were only around for a little over 30 years, it's still a brand respected by those Gen X and older who lived in the eastern United States. The history of Jamesway is an episode voted for and requested by the viewers on multiple occasions. If you'd like to vote for the next episode, make sure to like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for notifications. That way, polls like these will pop up in your feed. Thanks for watching and enjoy. A New York native named Herbert Fisher spent World War II serving in the Air Force. After the war, he worked as a merchandise packer, raking in a whopping $12 a week. This wasn't a lot of money, but it allowed Herbert to build up some savings. Throughout the 50s, discount retail was becoming big business. I suspect Herbert saw this as a big opportunity, and that's what led him to open his own discount department store. In 1961, he opened that store in Jamestown, New York. He named it Jamesway, after the city. Putting all of his savings into merchandise, Herbert designed strong founding principles of efficient buying and low markups. In its first year, Jamesway generated $750,000 in sales. Many early discounters went bust because of mutual issues. One of the biggest were bad locations. Avoiding this was the root of Jamesway's prosperity throughout the decade. In 1967, the Jamesway Corporation went public on the American Stock Exchange. In the 70s, Jamesway found themselves a tight niche between lesser competitors and leading discounters like Kmart, as well as fellow regionals like Zayre, Ames, and Bradley's, their principal competitors. There was also Caldor and Hills. The company spent its 10-year anniversary making crucial internal changes. With 18 stores in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, a good product mix kept them competitive, but it wasn't enough to be the cheapest anymore. Around this time was an event held by IBM, one that several retailers attended. Sam Walton was there, and another was Arlie Lazarus, Jamesway's vice president. Sam took the meeting to heart and invested big into computers for Wal-Mart. Lazarus didn't see things the same way, and didn't move to invest in logistics or tech. This caused Jamesway to lose out on a big push these would have given in following years. Lazarus didn't know it then, but this was a fatal mistake. The recession of the early 70s had a direct hand in the deaths of many chains, most of whom were barely holding on anyway. Many were slow to adapt to the suburbs and found themselves trapped in decaying downtown areas. Grant was in that same situation. They were a big industry loss, going out in 1976. Their death was the first big break for Jamesway, granting more space in the market. Discount retail was maturing, and shoppers were expecting more. Jamesway spent several million on in-store expansion and renovation. Their merchandising was directed at the middle-income shopper, with most of their customers being women. In 1977, the chain was nearing 50 stores and reported record revenue. Herbert became chairman, and Arlie Lazarus became president. As the decade ended, they'd successfully navigated the roughest market so far, but the next 10 years and on would be an all-out discount war. In 1980, New York-based Corvette's, the original discount department store, ceased operations. 2 guys died in 1982, followed by Woolco in '83 and King's in '84. All major names in American discount, all gone by the middle of the decade. Like in the 70s, Jamesway picked up many of these former stores and took over their markets. In more competitive areas, things were heating up big time. Zayre, based in Massachusetts, was the largest in the region. They had 275 stores. Ames had about 185 stores, many in the same markets. Hills, also in Massachusetts, had over 120 stores. Bradley's had 132, and Caldor was at 100 stores. That's not even mentioning Kmart. From the late King's chain came a man named Joe Attore. In 1983, he was named VP and General Merchandise Manager of Jamesway. He held that position until 1989, when he was hired out by Stewart's, a discount chain close to bankruptcy. He'd be back sooner than later. In August 1990, Arlie Lazarus resigned as president of Jamesway after 12 years in the position. He helped lead the company's greatest decade and brought them to $855 million in sales. His biggest mistake was the issue with new tech, something that had eroded the chain's appeal. By the next year, Jamesway operated 134 stores in 7 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. This would prove to be the company's peak, and it was only downhill from there. It was at this time that Wal-Mart finally expanded heavily into the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast. Jamesway began to experience weak sales and increasing operating losses. This was partly because of their outdated stores. After incorporating some computers in the late 60s, Jamesway didn't update much else. The first sign of things to come was the death of Herbert Fisher in '93. In addition to being a great long-standing leader, the 71-year-old was a Discount Hall of Fame inductee and an active philanthropist. Peter Hollis, then former president and CEO of Ames, had joined Jamesway as president in '91. Hollis reordered their financials. They brought in a new store format and planned to remodel the whole chain. In actuality, only about a quarter of them got an update. The chain was still very dated, and this kept shoppers away. June 1993 saw the return of Joe Ettore. He helped stewards come back from Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This time, Joe was king, president and CEO of Jamesway. But his administration would begin under intense pressure. The next month, Jamesway filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The company's future in the hardest market ever was now riding on Ettore's shoulders. During a year and a half of reorganization, they closed dozens of stores and cut several jobs. They had about 90 stores left over, some remodeled. Joe Ettore left Jamesway that year for the same position at Ames, an offer he couldn't refuse. He was replaced by Herbert Douglas from Bradley's. Douglas had big plans for Jamesway, with updated apparel and textile lines. Jamesway left bankruptcy in '95 and put itself up for sale. Ultimately, the company was out of money. Jamesway hadn't made a profit since 1990. There weren't many options at this point. It was either die slowly or try to reorganize again. They chose the latter and entered Chapter 11 a second time, also starting liquidation sales. The plan was if those stores sold out of inventory, they'd be up for closure. In the end, they decided to liquidate all 90 Jamesway stores. The sales lasted from October until Christmas '95, signaling its final gasp. The company's centrist marketing paid off well in the 70s. They weren't quite Kmart, but they also weren't Ames or Zayre. They rode that line until their death, the cause of which was that exact attitude. Like earlier discount casualties, Jamesway's outdated business practices rubbed off on the stores. They did so well in the 70s and 80s because they didn't have massive and all-powerful competition like Walmart. 1990 was the turning point not only for them, but also the United States economy, as it entered the intense 90 to 91 recession. This unlucky coincidence didn't help. For most, working at Jamesway was a real pleasure. The top people worked hard to get court approval to send off employees with severances of up to $4,000, the federal limit for companies in bankruptcy. This wasn't a shocker. Jamesway was like a family up until the end. After '95, it wasn't the customers who grieved the most, it was the people that worked there.